When our fellow humans are well disposed and don't regard us as crazy, the concept, the idea of the observer may arise. Finally, within the most favorable terms, these observers might be regarded as being capable to change the situation, their environment, their fellow humans, and themselves. The circle closes. The observed system becomes the observing system, and we realize that we are most intrinsically the self-organization we observe. In such a manner, thinking systemically, such observers easily recognize how all those complex systems like environment, society, fellow human beings, agreements made with fellow human beings, flow into what we call identity, what we describe as observation. In this, we have reached the point in the development of our story where the proceeding has advanced so far that the heroes and heroines of our story simultaneously become conscious of their involvement and the consequences of their involvement in the story, which means that their personal relation to the story unbosoms itself. This motive of self-knowledge is woven through all significant myths and stories. It enables the hero or heroine to establish a conscious relation to the inner dynamic of the story, and to transform it as the story transforms him or her through this transformation. Thus, change happens. Now, how exactly this change is happening depends on the kind of story. Either the hero finds out about his actual origin, becomes introduced to the undreamed-of potential of his abilities, or the heroine gets to know about the prophecy, curse, or blessing which has accompanied her since the beginning of the story. In other words, exactly how self-knowledge happens, how it is caused, and what it causes depends on the specific nature of the particular hero, particular heroine, the particular story which is about to become. What does this mean for our specific case, our own story? In understanding that our ways of acting determine our ways of perceiving, and our ways of perceiving determine our ways of acting, we begin to grasp how we ourselves create our own categories, notions, subjects, and objects through our perception. Through this process in which we turn our attention to the relation between different notions, we develop the notion of a notion, a circularity. A new category arises, the category of a category, or the category of the second order. In acting together, we determine what notions, like systemic thinking, the observer, the story, etc., mean for us. We invent those notions, just as we invented the notion of a notion, as it helps us to invent other notions. Thus, the system of our notions arises. Naturally, this simultaneously brings about an enormous responsibility for, as well as a deep connectedness with, the world. As we can no longer claim that these subjects and notions exist independent of us and have nothing to do with us. Considering this claim systemically, we immediately recognize it as a form of action. We see that through this exclusion of the other, the seeing of the context of our acting, the pattern which connects us with our world and ourselves is prevented. If we take this thought of exclusion as a point of departure for our observations, the context of our acting disappears. Through our very acting, we are going blind. But as we can see this, the thought of an outer order being separated from us contradicts our experience. It resembles the division of men into cerebral and corporal beings, as if there were people without bodies or people without heads. While from a systemic perspective, the head being a part of the body is of vital importance, just as we are an inseparable part of the world, its subjects, and its orders. The thought of the principal enclosure in a sense of embedment in the other is what makes the pattern of action that relates our thinking and our perception visible at all. Through this thought of embedment, these actions in which we let others participate, systemic thinking, acting, and perceiving comes forth, works, and flourishes as an observer, intrinsically connected with the environment, comes into existence through this very same process. At the same time, this way of thinking and living liberates us from an enormous burden, as now we neither can nor must know how the world is, how the world should be like. For as the structures and orders we perceive in this world arise through our agreements and actions, we can never finally tell conclusively how something is or should be, as we know that we perpetually bring into existence and change these very structures through our thinking and our acting. We can disregard this whole idea, the whole claim of knowing something. Together with Socrates, we can say, we know that we don't know. It is thus that this fundamental not knowing becomes our fortitude, which enables us, moment to moment, to invent and develop those notions, systems, and stories which we require for the tasks we set ourselves and the tasks which come forth through our particular way of living. Thus, all problems become problems of an observer, come forth through the way an observer, respectively a group of observers, perceives the world and acts upon its perceiving. This perspective has the incredible advantage that only that becomes a problem what we make our problem. Going to bed at night, we no longer lie down to sleep knowing about our world full of problems, the tiresome thinking that somewhere out there innumerable problems, countless tasks are lurking, and actually we should only come to rest when we have solved all of them, disappears. If we invest this imagination from a systemic perspective, from a second-order perspective, the idea of unsolved problems comes forth only when through our way of living we perceive events or facts as problems, and thus turn them into problems from which we later on try to rid ourselves from by the very means through which we created them in the first place. As long as we still have to reason with ourselves why a problem is no problem, why a problem no longer is a problem, we have not come to an agreement with ourselves. Our problem has not yet dissolved. We still perceive this event, this fact, as a problem. From a systemic perspective, every way of reasoning which does not categorically change our way of perceiving, which does not transform the perceived event into another category, is merely an interesting enrichment of the problem, nothing more. The more we reason, the more justifications we invent, the more interesting, the richer becomes our problem. From a systemic perspective, any argument or way of reasoning can only dissolve a problem if it actually changes our way of perceiving. So in telling our story, our actual challenge becomes, what kind of story are we telling, and whom are we telling it to? Or perhaps above all, how we are sharing the story we are becoming a part of. Out of this sharing of our stories, our form of living arises, determining what we experience and how we live. Through our life form, we become what we are, the world becomes what it is. In closing, let us allow Socrates to re-enter our systemic stage, seeing his demeanor towards knowledge and his acting from a systemic perspective. First and foremost, let us remember why we still remember Socrates at all. How does it come about that when over 2,500 years later, another great storyteller, Heinz von Förster, succeeds in explaining the most complex problems of science and philosophy in the most simple manner, we speak of him as the Socrates of cybernetics? Socrates was famous for his way of communicating with his fellow human beings, for his art of asking questions, for his way of introducing others and inviting them to participate in his way of thinking. In a Socratic manner of storytelling, in a Socratic position towards knowledge, we can again and again depart from our position of not knowing. We know that we don't know what the world is like. Hence, in every moment we are free to re-choose how we perceive and experience this world together. The more unexpected the questions and ideas that others bring into this, the more they help us to develop a common perspective of the world, the more intense this common experience becomes. This is how, with time, inventing and developing common ways of acting and perceiving becomes simpler. Living this, it becomes superficial to point out that the Socratic position equals our systemic position, just as it becomes superficial from a systemic perspective to ask if Socrates indeed acted or thought like this. We don't know. We don't have to know. It is part of our strength that we don't know. Thinking systemically, these are the actions of Socrates. We determine who Socrates is. We determine who Heinz von Förster is, just as we determine who the narrator, the listener, the reader of our story is. In every moment, we invent these characters anew. We become a storyteller to tell a story, and we become a listener, hoping to hear what was till now unheard of. Heinz von Förster would probably comment on this point. If a narrator tells us something about Heinz von Förster, we learn more about the narrator than about Heinz von Förster. Let's pause for a moment. What do you learn through my comment about Heinz von Förster's comment, about him and the narrator? Contemplating yourself, thinking about this, you already notice that at this point in the story, you have already become the narrator of this story, and that the narrator has already become the invention of yourself. Our story has become the system which connects Socrates, Heinz von Förster, the narrator, the listener, the reader, the system through which this group of observers stands together. It often remains intangible within a bedtime story what the allegory, metaphor, or plot actually was. Thinking, for example, of the wonderful bedtime story, The Arabian Nights, the narrator never allows the evolving pattern of one story blending into and becoming an intricate part of another come to an end. Never does she let the stream of narration break or cease, for then she would endanger herself to be condemned to death by the Caliph. In the end, he, being so moved by her story, experiences catharsis and abandons his intent to have her decapitated. This story of the Arabian Nights vividly shows us the most essential quality of a bedtime story, the ability to transform its listener. The proceeding of a story becomes in a manner which cannot be reached by rational argument alone, the story itself. Its proceeding is that what transforms. Or how my father quietly used to say when the time of our storytelling had come to an end, as I was just falling asleep. We are the story of the change that is happening through the sharing of our story, being completely formless until thought upon, talked upon, or perceived. This is how our story begins.
Thank you.